At 7:52 p.m. on November 9, 1994, under a blanket of low-hanging clouds that smothered a quiet residential block in northwest Houston, the first desperate call crackled across the emergency dispatch line. A neighbor had heard what sounded like gunshots, followed by a chilling stillness that stretched for agonizing moments. Within minutes, a patrol car veered onto the normally tranquil street, headlights bouncing off the wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle. Firefighters and paramedics arrived close behind, their red and white lights merging into a swirling pattern that reflected off puddles along the curb. The scene was eerily calm, save for the muted hum of engines and the occasional radio chatter. As an EMT rushed toward a motionless figure collapsed in a driveway, the illumination from nearby street lamps revealed the victim as a young woman, her long hair spilling out onto the concrete. She was barely clinging to life. Police officers immediately cordoned off the area, guiding neighbors back behind their doorways, asking them to recall anything suspicious: strange cars, unknown visitors, voices raised above the evening chatter. One resident mentioned a silhouette darting between the houses before vanishing into the shadows. Another swore they had seen someone in a dark jacket running down the street just after what they believed to be fireworks. Yet no one had enough details to piece together a complete picture. It was only when responders began their initial assessment that the full reality struck. The woman on the ground had been shot multiple times. Her heartbeat was faint, her pulse a fragile thing that threatened to slip away. By the time she was rushed into the back of an ambulance, frantic calls for a clear airway blending with the screech of tires, most on the scene already suspected the worst. Houston had another homicide on its hands. Within that tense, electric atmosphere, investigators tried to steady themselves for what they knew would be a difficult case. The assault on a seemingly innocent resident of a well-kept suburban enclave raised too many questions and offered almost no immediate answers. Street crime in that part of town was not unheard of, but this felt more personal, too specific in its execution to be a random assault. And as the victim was whisked away under the glow of ambulance lights, the first responders were left with a single chilling certainty: a life was teetering on the brink, and a gunman, or perhaps more than one, was out there, free in the hush of that cloudy November night. It would take months of tireless investigation, a tangle of conflicting testimony, and the discovery of buried motives before Houston learned the unsettling truth. This was a murder-for-hire plot, and it would implicate people far closer to the victim than anyone on that rainy street could have guessed. In the coming weeks, the name of the victim, identified as a 33-year-old mother named Vicki Daniel, would become a fixture on local newscasts. So would the name of her estranged husband, Robert Fratta, a former law enforcement officer and bodybuilder who had been locked in a bitter custody battle with Vicki. The collision of those two lives had led to a lethal scheme that would shock even jaded investigators. In the hours following the shooting, as police cruisers prowled the neighborhood and forensics teams scoured every inch of the driveway for clues, Houston's swirling clouds finally unleashed a steady drizzle. Rain dripped from mailboxes, pooled in gutters, and blurred the yellow crime scene tape. It felt like the city itself was weeping for what had happened. Beneath that steady patter, however, the seeds of a meticulous investigation were already being planted. No one who stepped onto that street that night could have predicted just how intricate this case would become, or how it would eventually set a legal precedent for orchestrated homicide in Texas. Vicki Daniel's life had begun to slip away under those cloud-choked skies, triggering an urgent flurry of medical efforts. But in the frenzy to save her, detectives realized that their best chance at a swift resolution lay in preserving every thread of evidence that might lead to the shooter and anyone pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Even as the emergency vehicle carrying Vicki sped away, they were sealing off the block, noting tire treads, and marking footprints on damp concrete. The weather would wash away many physical traces, so quick thinking and methodical work would be crucial in capturing whatever remained. Hours later, as the clock neared midnight, investigators huddled over coffee and half-soaked notepads to begin the slow, demanding process of unraveling the story behind the shots. At that time, few people in Houston realized that the tragedy gripping this suburban corner would reach into the city's legal system, the media, and the hearts of an entire community, culminating in a murder trial that would leave an enduring mark on how justice was pursued for a contract killing. Vicki had been moved into emergency surgery, her injuries too severe for anything but a grim prognosis. Even as operating room lights glinted off surgical instruments and her medical team worked in a synchronized rhythm to revive her, homicide detectives were preparing themselves for the possibility that this was no mere assault. By sunrise, the question of whether Vicki would survive hung in the air like the dampness left by the night's drizzle. That doubt seeped into every conversation about the case. Then came the news everyone had feared. Vicki had succumbed to her wounds. The coroner's determination later that day was painfully definitive. Multiple gunshot wounds, inflicted at close range, had ended her life. That single fact underscored the sense that this was not an indiscriminate crime. It was targeted, deliberate, and packed with personal animosity. As the local media caught wind of the tragedy, the story grew. Journalists stood before cameras on that same street, the yellow tape fluttering behind them, while neighbors peered out from their curtains, quietly praying for a swift resolution. Little did they know that the resolution would be anything but swift. It would demand the dismantling of an insidious arrangement, one that stretched from suburban living rooms to the dark corners where hired guns agreed to commit murder for a price. And once the name Robert Fratta was introduced into public discourse, no one in Houston would ever forget it. The tangled web of personal grievances, secret dealings, and a controlling husband's lethal plan would soon become part of the city's collective memory, a cautionary tale of how domestic disputes and vengeful obsession can detonate into mortal violence. To understand the full depth of that tragedy, it is essential to follow the arcs of Vicki's life and Robert's transformation from a local police officer to a husband hell-bent on removing an obstacle from his life by the most horrifying means possible. Their stories began in separate corners of Houston, but they collided on that rainy November night in 1994, leaving behind a question that would haunt the community for years. How could a suburban mother's life end on her own driveway, and how could the father of her children be implicated in orchestrating that fatal plan? Vicki's early years were unremarkable, yet filled with the promise of a bright future. She grew up in a typical Houston neighborhood, forging friendships that lasted well beyond high school. Her family described her as empathetic, hardworking, a budding dreamer who wanted to find love and stability. She had a knack for comforting people around her, whether it was volunteering in community events or simply lending an ear to a friend in need. As she blossomed into adulthood, she balanced responsibilities with hopeful aspirations of a happy marriage, children, and a cozy home. Houston provided ample opportunities for someone with her warmth and diligence, and she was determined to make the most of it. The city was booming, with new developments sprouting up, creating the sense that anything was possible for those prepared to work for it. Vicki was certainly prepared to work. Around the same time, Robert Fratta was shaping his own identity. He was the type of figure one might see at a local gym, cutting an imposing figure with his muscular physique and a demeanor that suggested unwavering confidence. He served as a public safety officer, others describe him as occasionally working in security, yet his background in law enforcement gave him a certain presence that set him apart. He was, by most accounts, devoted to physical fitness, proud and eager to establish himself as a man of authority. The community around him recognized the badge and uniform, but privately he wrestled with insecurities and control issues that would later come to define him. When their paths intersected, Vicki was drawn in part to his self-assured aura and the promise of protection it seemed to offer. He found in her someone who could be caring and responsive to his needs. At first they seemed like the ideal pair, him with an air of command, her with a gentle but purposeful spirit. Yet, beneath the surface of their initially happy relationship, deeper rifts were forming. As time passed, Robert's controlling tendencies emerged, overshadowing the gentle dynamic that had once been the cornerstone of their bond. Arguments grew in frequency and intensity, often sparked by his need to dictate decisions about the household, the children, and Vicki's personal independence. The tension was palpable even to acquaintances, who noticed that Vicki began withdrawing from social engagements and confiding less in her friends. This mounting pressure led to a rocky, drawn-out dispute that ultimately became a complex custody battle when they decided to separate. The controversy over their children's living arrangements sparked fierce confrontations. Police were occasionally called to their home to mediate arguments or check on Vicki's well-being. When friends and neighbors remarked that these spats revealed an explosive temper in Robert, coupled with Vicki's growing fear that her husband's anger was beyond anything she could manage. During those turbulent months, Vicki sought emotional support from close relatives and confidants. She was unwavering in her mission to protect her children, but she also feared the potential for violence. Financial strain added another layer of stress as Robert's approach to dividing assets and expenses became increasingly antagonistic. Vicki contemplated whether she should relocate entirely, leaving behind the city she had always known, just to keep her children and herself safe from Robert's unpredictable wrath. Legal proceedings advanced at a snail's pace, further fueling the frustration on both sides. Court documents would eventually reflect this tension, capturing in black and white text the swirling chaos that was their personal lives. Then came the fateful night in November, where all the tension that had been building quietly in some respects, loudly in others, came to its devastating conclusion. The crime scene was stark. Someone had walked up to Vicki in her own driveway and fired multiple shots at close range. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting the gunman had staked out the area in advance, waiting for her to return home. That professional aura, that sense of a planned ambush, led detectives to quickly consider the possibility that the shooting was not random. Bit by bit, evidence emerged: communications, suspicious phone calls, accounts from individuals who knew Robert, that pointed toward a murder-for-hire plot. All of those discoveries painted a menacing portrait of a man who had grown deeply resentful of his wife and was determined to remove her from his life with lethal finality. Vicki's funeral, attended by a heartbroken cluster of relatives, friends, and supporters, became a moment of collective mourning for a community that had only just begun to grasp the full implications of what had happened. Her death stood as a tragic reminder of the dangers that can arise when a contentious domestic situation escalates without intervention. Those who stepped up to speak during the service remembered her as a loving mother, a compassionate friend, and someone who had dreams she was never given the chance to fulfill. One of her closest friends would later describe how Vicki's focus was always on creating a stable, nurturing environment for her children. But that dream had been snatched away in a single night of gunfire. Meanwhile, Robert Fratta was quickly becoming a prominent figure in the criminal investigation. Whether pacing in an interrogation room or responding to reporters who had caught wind of the tension in his marriage, he displayed a demeanor that wavered between dispassionate confidence and bursts of hostility. Detectives, seasoned by years of analyzing suspects' statements, noted an air of detachment in his reactions to Vicki's death. It was an indifference that fueled their suspicion. In time, informants who overheard Robert complaining about his marital problems came forward, some recounting that he had joked or threatened that he would find a way to get rid of Vicki. These statements alone didn't prove murder for hire, but they certainly bolstered the detectives' growing theory. Law enforcement began linking phone records, scouring timesheets, identifying persons of interest, and conducting interviews to fill in the gaps. That was when two other figures emerged from the periphery, men who had allegedly been involved in a covert arrangement. One was identified as the hired gun, the other as the middleman who connected the dots between Robert's rage and the shooter's willingness to commit murder for money. The question wasn't just whether Robert had arranged the killing. Detectives were increasingly confident he had. It was whether they could prove it in a court of law. By the time the media was fixating on every new development, the raw complexity of the case was laid bare for the public to see. Public sentiment tilted strongly in favor of seeking the harshest punishment possible if Robert's guilt was established, reflecting a city's moral outrage over the cold-blooded elimination of a mother of three. Before the trial began, the question of motive never seemed in doubt. The custody battle, Robert's obsession with control, the rumors of extramarital affairs, and his own financial constraints formed a powerful backdrop to the allegations. From the outside, it looked straightforward. A man with law enforcement knowledge used his connections to orchestrate a crime that would rid him of his estranged wife. Yet, for the justice system, nothing is ever straightforward. Proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he had hired someone to kill Vicki required an airtight chain of evidence, corroborated by witness testimony and physical proof that the middleman had indeed acted on Robert's directives. While community members reeled from the brutality of the act, the prosecutors were left to compile a cohesive narrative that would stand up to judicial scrutiny. Houston's legal community braced itself for a complex battle, aware that murder-for-hire cases often involve a labyrinth of hearsay, reluctant witnesses, and potential procedural pitfalls. Vicki's family, for their part, wanted closure. They wanted to see the man responsible for her death, whether it was Robert himself or those he had manipulated, held accountable. They sat through countless meetings with investigators and attorneys, reliving the tragedy in excruciating detail. Each new piece of information about the alleged murder-for-hire plot felt like a knife twisting in the wound. This was no impulsive act of domestic passion. It was deliberate, planned, and cold, possibly put in motion months before the actual shooting. That level of premeditation weighed heavily on their hearts. In the end, the city of Houston would watch a trial that laid bare the anatomy of a murder-for-hire scheme. The conspiratorial discussions, the exchange of money, the roles each participant played. Experts in forensic science would connect ballistic evidence to the type of firearm used in the shooting. Phone logs and testimony would illustrate how Robert had contacted intermediaries to find a willing killer. Friends and family members would testify about Robert's controlling disposition and disturbing talk of wanting to eliminate Vicki. Prosecutors would weave all of this into a damning tapestry, while the defense struggled to frame the allegations as circumstantial or fueled by personal vendettas. At stake was not just the fate of one man, but the future of 3 children left motherless, a community that demanded justice, and a system entrusted with delivering truth in the face of heartbreak. It would take years for the case to wind through appeals and legal complexities, but ultimately, Robert Fratta was convicted, marking the final chord in a tragedy that began on a dark, cloudy evening in November 1994. In the aftermath, the profound sense of injustice would remain. A mother's life had been mercilessly cut short, leaving open wounds in her family and in the broader community. Even so, the court's determination to hold the conspirators accountable stood as a testament to the seriousness with which the justice system regards domestic violence and murder-for-hire plots. The reverberations of the case would influence not just those directly involved, but also how authorities and the legal system approach orchestrated homicides for years to come. Vicki, remembered for her kindness and her devotion to her children, remained the heartbreaking symbol of a life taken far too soon. As details of her story circulated widely, she became an emblem of the need to recognize red flags in toxic relationships, and to advocate for individuals caught in dangerous domestic disputes. Across news segments and community gatherings, her face and name would be invoked in calls for better protections, swifter intervention, and more attentive responses to threats. At the same time, Robert Fratta's downfall served as an unsettling example of how a person entrusted with authority can leverage knowledge of police procedures and community networks to commit an unthinkable act. The tension between duty and personal vendetta, between paternal responsibilities and lethal betrayal, made the saga all the more horrifying and unforgettable. To fully comprehend the layers behind that November night, it is crucial to understand who Vicki was, how she came to be trapped in such a toxic dynamic, and how she struggled until the final moments to protect herself and her children. It is equally critical to explore Robert's journey, from a public safety figure and bodybuilder to the orchestrator of a contract killing. Only by delving into their lives can we grasp the magnitude of what Houston witnessed that autumn. A tragedy fueled by obsession, culminating in the ultimate betrayal of trust, and ending in a legal resolution that would color the city's collective memory of crime and punishment. End quote. And Vicki's background brimmed with optimism, shaped by a middle-class upbringing in a family that valued both discipline and compassion. Born and raised in Houston, she lived with her parents, who worked modest jobs but strove to ensure that she never lacked the basics. She grew up appreciating the simple joys: a day at the local park, Sunday dinners with extended family, and the occasional weekend trip to the Gulf Coast. Vicki's great draw on the weekend trips to the Gulf Coast. From a young age, Vicki demonstrated a blend of warmth and resolve. She would help neighbors carry groceries, assist younger cousins with homework, and remain actively involved in community events. Early reports suggest she volunteered at a local youth center as a teen, where she organized fundraisers and planned weekend activities. Friends remember her as the one everyone turned to for emotional support. Whenever a classmate felt down, Vicki was there with a sympathetic ear and quiet encouragement. After high school, she took courses at a local community college, juggling part-time jobs to support herself. Though her academic pursuits did not lead to a 4-year degree, she took pride in the foundational education she received. Her real passion lay in building a stable home life. She yearned for marriage, children, and the security of a loving household, a vision shaped in part by the modest but tight-knit world of her own upbringing. And when she met Robert Fratta, who was then working in law enforcement, it seemed like a dream fulfilled. Here was a strong, confident figure who could provide the stability and sense of safety she had always valued. She confided in friends that she felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was the man with whom she would share her life's journey. Socially, Vicki was well connected. She had relatives across Houston, from the suburban neighborhoods to the more bustling downtown enclaves, and maintained friendships that dated back to grade school. Her circle of acquaintances adored her caring spirit and the way she would devote herself fully to any responsibility, be it in her work, her friendships, or eventually, her role as a mother. Prior to marriage, she worked in administrative roles for local businesses, known for her meticulousness and pleasant demeanor. Bosses praised her reliability. Co-workers quickly turned to her for advice or simply for her company over lunch breaks. She'd listen empathetically, often taking on others' troubles as her own. That generosity of spirit was widely admired. Yet it also made her vulnerable to those who might exploit her kindness. Meanwhile, in the fullness of time, Robert's more authoritarian nature clashed with her gentle approach, creating an environment that would eventually trap her in a cycle of fear and submission. When Vicki and Robert married, the honeymoon period was bright and affectionate. She gave birth to children who became the center of her world. Her days revolved around feedings, diaper changes, school drop-offs, and celebrations of small milestones. She relished motherhood, seeing it as her most important calling. Even as the relationship with Robert began to sour, she tried her best to shield her children from parental discord. She'd planned birthdays meticulously, ensuring each child felt special, and signed them up for extracurricular activities that expanded their horizons. The notion that her children would grow up without the freedom she experienced as a child deeply concerned her, especially as Robert's controlling behavior escalated. Toward the end, Vicki's social connections faltered because she felt a growing sense of shame and vulnerability about her deteriorating marriage. Friends noticed she was more hesitant to accept invitations or had become guarded in conversation. She confided in only a select few about the verbal threats and controlling episodes at home. Even then, she tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy for her children's sake. Occasionally, she would stay over with relatives when the tension at home became unbearable, but she was always careful to keep the conflict private. In her final months, as the custody battle raged on, she told a cousin about her worries that Robert would never let her live independently. She was deeply torn. On one hand, she contemplated leaving Houston entirely to start fresh, while on the other, she longed for reconciliation or at least a peaceful co-parenting arrangement for the children she cherished. A final timeline of her life in the weeks before her murder shows a woman stretched to her limits. Court dates consumed her, phone calls from attorneys swirled like a never-ending storm, and financial worries multiplied as Robert's support became irregular. Despite all of that, she strove to maintain her part-time job, determined to keep the household afloat. Those who saw her in that stretch recall a noticeable tension in her face, an anxious glance over her shoulder whenever she was out in public. She was convinced Robert might try to catch her off guard to manipulate the custody situation, or worse, intimidate her into submission. She had confided that her greatest fear was that he would do something drastic, but even she had not fully fathomed the possibility that drastic might mean orchestrating a contracted killing. In her final days, Vicki's mindset seemed resigned yet resolute. She was tired of the arguments, of legal complexities, of living in the shadow of fear. But she was also driven to protect her children, to break free from a stifling environment. She told a friend that once the court made a definitive ruling, she planned to move somewhere else, possibly to stay with family or to a different part of Houston where Robert's reach might be less pervasive. There is a bittersweet quality to those final confidences. Though she sensed a looming threat, she still held on to hope that she could carve out a peaceful life. That last glimmer of optimism stands as a solemn testament to her character. Even amid turmoil and intimidation, she believed in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Robert Fratta's early life was not characterized by the same gentle warmth that defined Vicki's. Raised in an environment that valued discipline, he learned from a young age how to assert his presence. Accounts from his teenage years describe an ambitious young man determined to stand out. Athletic pursuits quickly became a focal point: weightlifting, bodybuilding, and eventually police training. He took pride in his physique, often entering competitions and deriving a sense of identity from the attention it garnered. While he occasionally enjoyed the camaraderie that came from the gym, he also began to cultivate an aura of intimidating control. That desire for dominance found a parallel in his path toward a career in law enforcement. Early stints included security work, volunteer deputy roles, or other positions that granted him a uniform and a badge. Each reinforced his self-perception as an authority figure, someone who deserved respect and compliance. In relationships, Robert's dominant persona often overshadowed any tender impulses. He did know how to charm people when it suited him, especially in the initial phases of a romantic relationship. But beneath that charm lurked a conviction that his partner's role was to follow his lead, no questions asked. Close acquaintances from that time remember him as brash, often boastful, and sometimes casually dismissive of others' feelings. Even so, there was a certain magnetism to his confidence that could be alluring. When he and Vicki first met, he recognized in her a warm spirit that seemed ready to nurture his needs. For a while, this provided a sense of balance: her caring nature and his take-charge attitude. As their marriage progressed, Robert's psychological profile leaned increasingly toward rigidity and a hunger for absolute control. He expected Vicki to manage the household according to his preferences and grew frustrated or enraged if she deviated from his expectations. Compromise was not a skill he valued, submission was. Professionally, he found himself in an environment where he could exercise authority with minimal pushback. His peers recall episodes where his rigid approach to policing or security work created friction, but he often brushed aside criticism, attributing it to incompetence on the part of others. He prided himself on being by the book, but in truth, that often translated to a narrow, authoritarian interpretation of rules. Psychologically, many who encountered him felt that Robert harbored deep-seated insecurities. His obsession with bodybuilding, his insistence on absolute control within his family, and his need for external validation all pointed to a fragile sense of self-worth that required constant reinforcement. When Vicki began to assert her independence, questioning his temper, seeking personal space, refusing to acquiesce to his every demand, Robert's sense of insecurity morphed into resentment. He viewed her evolving autonomy not as healthy self-determination, but as a direct threat to his authority. That sense of threat escalated when she initiated divorce and custody proceedings. Each court appearance, each visitation hearing, felt like an affront to his self-hypnosis, a public challenge to the persona he had worked so hard to cultivate. Within his social context, Robert straddled multiple worlds. He had acquaintances in law enforcement or security, some in the bodybuilding circuit, and a handful of personal friends who described him as a straight shooter who spoke his mind. However, many were also wary of him, noting his quick temper and a penchant for making comments that hinted at darker impulses. Rumors circulated that he had once said he would never let Vicki take his children away without a fight, that he would fix the problem if it ever came to that. Even though some dismissed these remarks as posturing, investigators later used them as evidence of Robert's premeditation. Over time, his network included unsavory characters, people who operated on the fringes of legality, and could, for the right price, be enlisted to do things he felt would never be traced back to him. As the custody battle intensified, his worldview narrowed. He saw Vicki as the single greatest obstacle to his control over the children. Her refusal to comply with his demands filled him with a sense of betrayal and wounded pride. He reacted by waging a legal and psychological war, withholding child support payments, making threats, and spreading rumors about her unfitness as a mother. In this period, one can trace the seeds of his eventual leap into criminal planning. He became convinced that if legal channels failed to restore his authority, extra-legal methods might be justifiable. Instead of seeking therapy or negotiating a truce, he dug in. He began expressing fantasies of a future where Vicki would no longer be an issue, and he, presumably, would regain complete control over his children and his life. The path toward criminal evolution came into sharper focus when Robert started confiding in an acquaintance about solving his marital problems in a permanent way. Investigators would later uncover discussions he had about hiring a hitman, though they lacked direct proof of money changing hands initially. The idea seemed to crystallize as his court battles grew more contentious. He knew from his law enforcement background what kind of evidence might be needed to prove a murder for hire, so he operated cautiously, using intermediaries and coded language to maintain plausible deniability. In phone records, credit card statements, and surreptitious meetings, one can trace the outline of a plan forming. Robert wanted Vicki dead, and he was prepared to pay or manipulate others to make that happen. On the surface, he tried to maintain an image of a father unjustly wronged by a flawed family court system, but behind closed doors his frustration boiled over. Eventually, a middleman connected him to the shooter, an individual whose desperation for money made him susceptible to such an unthinkable act. Although Robert likely believed he was covering his tracks, each phone call, each conversation, each quiet arrangement with a go-beater left a thread for investigators to follow. When Vicki was gunned down, Robert probably counted on the assumption that the job would appear random. In the end, though, the net of suspicion closed around him, revealing a deeply unnerving picture of a man who had allowed his thirst for control to consume every moral boundary. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Robert was seen frequenting gyms, continuing to train as if nothing was amiss. Neighbors who spoke with him found his demeanor surprisingly casual. He occasionally dropped references to the court proceedings, always casting himself as the victim of Vicki's manipulative tactics. Some of these neighbors later testified that his composure struck them as strange, given the acrimony of the divorce. Yet no one imagined that beneath that surface calm, he was finalizing a plan to end Vicki's life. By the time she lay dying in her driveway, the plan had been set in motion for weeks, or even months. The crime that transpired was not a heat-of-the-moment outburst. It was a calculated assassination, commissioned by a man who refused to let his estranged wife claim her independence. In the weeks after her murder, as police focused their gaze more sharply on Robert, his responses wavered between dismissive and confrontational. Even when evidence began to mount linking him to the hired gun and the intermediary, he insisted the allegations were fabricated. He tried to leverage the drama for sympathy, telling some people he was being framed. It was a final attempt to maintain the control he had always craved. Eventually, though, the state's case would prove formidable. Phone records, eyewitness testimony, and even confessions from accomplices painted an incontrovertible picture of his role in the murder. In one sense, Robert Fratta never changed. Even during the legal proceedings, he clung to the belief that he was the wronged party. Yet, from another angle, he had transformed completely from a brash but lawful authority figure into the prime suspect in one of Houston's most shocking contract killings. His story would become a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of obsession and the dangerous extremes to which some individuals will go when they believe their sense of dominance is under siege. To piece together the events leading up to that chilling November night, one must look at the months of tension that preceded it. The seeds were planted well before the final confrontation, in daily arguments, custody hearings, phone calls that ended with slammed receivers, and unspoken threats that escalated with each passing week. Vicki tried to keep life as normal as possible for her children, juggling her job and household duties. She managed school drop-offs, read bedtime stories, and maintained a semblance of routine even as her personal sense of safety deteriorated. Robert, meanwhile, felt increasingly cornered by family court rulings that favored joint custody, which threatened his self-perception as the ultimate authority. Whenever he ran into a legal setback, he grew more vocal about the injustice he believed he was facing. One of the key trigger events occurred when Vicki filed a motion to limit Robert's visitation rights due to his erratic behavior. Friends recalled how furious he became upon receiving notice of this motion. His outbursts, once contained behind closed doors, spilled into public tirades. He called Vicki's friends, accusing them of poisoning her mind against him, and even confronted her family members with accusations that they were conspiring to rob him of his paternal rights. This escalation created a climate of fear. Although those close to Vicki encouraged her to seek restraining orders or additional police protection, she hesitated. She worried that any aggressive legal move would provoke him further, ironically placing her in greater danger. Around the same time, Robert initiated behind-the-scenes conversations with individuals he knew from the local fitness and security circles. Witnesses later revealed that he was asking vague questions about whether certain tasks, like scaring someone or convincing them to drop a lawsuit, could be arranged. The shift from bluster to specific inquirers about intimidation signaled a pivotal turning point. Investigators believe that these early inquiries laid the groundwork for the actual murder-for-hire arrangement. Had someone intervened decisively at this stage, either a friend or fellow officer who picked up on the gravity of Robert's intentions, events might have taken a different turn. The final days leading up to November 9 were a blur of custody negotiations and fraught phone calls. Vicki had learned that Robert's supporters were making slanderous statements about her personal life, claiming she was unfit as a mother. She began confiding in a close friend that she worried for her safety, that Robert's anger had grown unmanageable. Nevertheless, she held on to the hope that the system would protect her, that the law would affirm her right to live free from harassment. Tragically, the system could not move fast enough. On the night of the murder, Vicki was returning from a visit with a friend. She parked her car in the driveway, presumably relieved to be home. Evidence suggests the killer had been waiting for her, hidden either behind bushes or perhaps a nearby vehicle. The street was dark. Most neighbors had already settled into their evening routines. In a swift, brutal act, the assailant fired multiple shots at close range. Neighbors who heard the shots described them as sharp cracks that echoed briefly before silence flooded the street again. While the paramedics arrived swiftly, the extent of Vicki's injuries was catastrophic. She was rushed to an emergency unit, but her life slipped away before surgical interventions could turn the tide. The crime scene was painstakingly examined by forensics experts. They found shell casings consistent with a handgun at close range. They noted footprints near the driveway, likely blurred by the slick pavement. They identified a suspiciously parked car spotted by a neighbor earlier that evening, though the witness could provide only a partial description. No money or valuables were stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry to the home. Everything pointed to an intentional, targeted hit. As the evidence began to converge, investigators dissected the method used in the crime. The shooter's approach, lying in wait, choosing the driveway as the kill zone, indicated planning. This was not a chaotic burglary gone awry or a random mugging. It bore all the hallmarks of an execution. The ballistic evidence confirmed that multiple rounds were fired rapidly, suggesting the killer was practiced with firearms. Detectives hypothesized that Robert might have leveraged his connections in the security or law enforcement community to find someone with expertise in weapons. In the immediate aftermath, neighbors and local reporters swarmed the area, desperate for any explanation. Why would someone target a suburban mother of three? As the police started canvassing and taking statements, Robert's name surfaced quickly. Not only was he her estranged husband, but multiple witnesses recounted how publicly he had expressed anger about the ongoing custody dispute. A few even mentioned hearing him speak about wanting to be free of Vicki. For law enforcement, these tidbits became puzzle pieces. A motive existed, an opportunity was plausible, and now they needed the direct link that could prove he had arranged the killing. For Robert, the post-crime period was a frenzy of denial coupled with erratic behavior. He showed minimal outward grief, which drew scrutiny from those who observed him. Phone records, carefully compiled by investigators, began to reveal suspicious calls placed before and after the murder. A middleman, who would later become a star witness at trial, came to the forefront. Initially, he denied involvement, but as the net of suspicion tightened, he provided a confession indicating Robert had paid him to locate a contract killer. Meanwhile, the physical evidence, shell casings, footprints, and ballistic reports, was sent to specialized labs. Technicians worked to confirm whether the ammunition matched firearms that had been used in other crimes or were owned by known associates of Robert. While no single piece of forensic evidence could conclusively identify the triggerman, the combination of ballistic data, phone records, and financial transactions created a formidable case when cross-referenced. Some leads initially took law enforcement down dead ends, but others yielded critical breakthroughs. A faint partial print lifted from the scene hinted at the hired gun's presence. The middleman's bank records suggested unusual cash deposits coinciding with times Robert had allegedly withdrawn money. Each new detail helped shape a mosaic that illustrated the complexity of the murder for hire. During the first 2 days after the murder, detectives concentrated on standard homicide protocols, thoroughly questioning neighbors, combing the crime scene for physical clues, and reviewing Vicki's phone history to see if she had received any threatening calls. With her children temporarily placed in the care of relatives, investigators also interviewed them, gently, mindful of their grief, to see if they had overheard any alarming conversations. Although the children could not provide direct evidence, they did reflect on the tension at home, which further underscored the possibility that Robert's anger might have metastasized into lethal action. Law enforcement also reached out to local businesses for surveillance footage, hoping to find images of suspicious cars in the area on the night of the shooting. While some cameras were found at gas stations or convenience stores nearby, the footage often turned out too grainy or inconclusive to be definitive. Still, a partial glimpse of a vehicle that matched the shooter's description surfaced, offering valuable corroboration for the time frame of the attack. By the third day, suspicion focused squarely on Robert. Detectives interviewed him at length, noting inconsistencies in his account of his whereabouts the night of the murder. Though he insisted he was nowhere near Vicki's house, phone records placed him in the vicinity earlier in the evening. His attitude swung from belligerent to detached, fueling the investigators' sense that he was more concerned about self-preservation than finding the truth. They confronted him with rumors that he had been seeking someone to take care of Vicki, but Robert feigned ignorance. Nevertheless, each new piece of evidence chipped away at his denials. With preliminary forensic reports in hand, authorities started building their case. The shell casings were linked to a specific type of handgun favored by certain security professionals, a small yet important detail. Interviews with Robert's associates confirmed that he sometimes discussed the .38 Special, or 9mm handguns, though no direct link emerged yet. Forensic technicians also ran gunpowder residue tests on clothing found near the suspected shooter's living space after the middleman identified him. While the tests were not always conclusive, partial traces of residue suggested strong involvement. Simultaneously, detectives zeroed in on how the money might have changed hands. Bank statements showed Robert withdrawing several $1,000s in the weeks prior to the murder. The middleman had corresponding deposits. The actual hitman, once identified, had also come into money, which he tried to hide by making purchases through a third party. Piecing together these transactions required subpoenaing financial records, analyzing bank logs, and conducting interviews under oath. The result was a paper trail that pointed unmistakably to a coordinated effort. While Robert protested that he was simply rearranging funds for personal reasons, the timing of these withdrawals matched too perfectly with the testimony about a murder-for-hire deal to be coincidence. By the fourth week, investigators had formal arrest warrants. Robert, the middleman, and the alleged shooter were taken into custody. Each was interrogated separately, but their stories contradicted one another. The middleman eventually reached a deal with prosecutors, agreeing to testify against Robert in exchange for a reduced sentence. The shooter maintained he had only pulled the trigger because he needed quick cash and believed, wrongly, that this was some kind of vigilante justice. The official narrative became clearer. Robert had orchestrated it all, offering money to the middleman who then recruited the triggerman. While Robert tried to distance himself from the final act, phone records, financial logs, and the middleman's confession painted him as the linchpin in the scheme. Case development proceeded in phases. The investigators spent months ensuring their evidence was airtight. They sought ballistic experts who could testify convincingly about the shell casings and trajectory analyses. They compiled recorded telephone exchanges, some laced with incriminating language that hinted Robert was the one controlling the situation from behind the scenes. Prosecutors worked closely with the forensic team to craft a narrative that would hold up in court. Robert had motive, the custody dispute, means, his connections and resources, and opportunity, he orchestrated the timeline. As the court date neared, legal analysts predicted a sensational trial. The media, too, circled like hawks, feeding the public's appetite for the drama of a seemingly upstanding law enforcement figure accused of killing his estranged wife. Before the trial formally commenced, Robert was charged with capital murder, given that Texas law treats murder for hire as a capital offense. The middleman and the shooter faced comparable charges, albeit with some differences in potential sentencing due to their different roles. Each defendant went through pre-trial motions, including bail hearings, competency evaluations, and discovery disputes. Robert's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the middleman was simply lying to reduce his own sentence, and that phone records did not directly prove Robert's involvement. The prosecution countered by systematically revealing how each piece of evidence fit into a coherent mosaic of guilt. The prosecution's argument stressed that Robert's controlling personality was the catalyst, that he explicitly sought to remove Vicki to win custody and escape financial obligations. They called upon friends and relatives who recounted Robert's threats, as well as investigators who explained how the murder scene indicated careful planning. Forensic experts testified about ballistic matches and the pattern of bullet wounds, which strongly suggested an execution-style shooting rather than a random robbery. The middleman's testimony was the linchpin, however. On the stand, he described how Robert met with him on multiple occasions, providing partial payments and instructions. That eyewitness account, backed by phone logs and bank statements, dealt a crushing blow to Robert's defense. The defense attempted a variety of strategies. They claimed that Vicki might have had other enemies, that the middleman was an untrustworthy individual with a criminal record. They attacked the credibility of forensic evidence, suggesting contamination at the crime scene. But these maneuvers paled in comparison to the weight of the prosecution's meticulously organized presentation. Robert, for his part, appeared subdued in court, no longer the dominant force he once projected. Observers noted he maintained a sense of entitlement, as though he still believed he would walk free. That aloofness likely did not endear him to the jury, which seemed visibly moved by the descriptions of Vicki's final moments and the heartbreak of her children. Once the jury deliberated, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Robert was sentenced in accordance with Texas's harsh penalties for murder for hire. The middleman and the shooter also faced significant prison sentences, although the middleman's willingness to cooperate somewhat mitigated his punishment. The collective sense of relief in the courtroom was palpable. For Vicki's family and friends, the verdict brought the first glimmer of closure they had felt since that horrendous November night. Although it could never bring her back, seeing justice served offered some solace. In the immediate wake of the trial, the community's response was shaped by a mixture of sorrow and outrage. Candlelight vigils were held, both to honor Vicki's life and to highlight the dangers of domestic violence. Women's advocacy groups pointed to the murder as a grim reminder that emotional abuse and controlling behavior can escalate to lethal violence if not addressed early on. They lobbied local government and law enforcement agencies for more robust interventions and protective measures for victims seeking to break free from toxic relationships. This led to a short-term upswing in public awareness campaigns, resources for battered women's shelters, and training programs aimed at identifying red flags of domestic abuse. For Vicki's immediate family, the impact was devastating. Her children lost their mother to violence orchestrated by their father, leaving them grappling with unimaginable emotional turmoil. Extended relatives rallied around them, providing as stable a home life as possible. Therapists and social workers stepped in to guide the children through the labyrinth of trauma. Each child struggled to reconcile the love they might have felt for their father with the horror of what he had done. While legal processes addressed custody and guardianship, the family was forced to navigate the lasting scars left by Robert's betrayal. In time, they found a measure of peace, but the emotional wounds never fully healed. Long-term, the case gained a dark immortality in Houston's collective memory. It became one of the emblematic examples of domestic disputes that escalate into murder, shaping public discourse on issues like restraining orders, spousal support conflicts, and the psychological profiles of controlling partners. In legal circles, the Fratta case was cited in discussions about murder-for-hire jurisprudence, evidentiary standards, and the complexities of proving conspiracy when multiple parties are involved. Proposals for mandatory psychological evaluations in divorce cases involving signs of extreme behavior were briefly floated, though no sweeping legislative changes emerged. Nevertheless, the case reinforced the principle that contracting a murder is as grave an offense as physically committing it. Future murder-for-hire investigations in Texas drew lessons from how meticulously Houston police had to coordinate phone records, financial logs, and witness testimony to secure convictions. Prosecutors and judges alike referenced the case when emphasizing how cunningly certain perpetrators conceal their involvement. In that sense, Vicki's tragic death indirectly fortified the legal system's ability to tackle orchestrated homicides, signaling that cunning and money would not place suspects beyond the reach of justice. Historically, the murder and subsequent trial left a sobering imprint on the mid-1990s criminal landscape in Texas. Coming as it did during a period when crime rates were a persistent concern, it underscored the vulnerabilities within domestic settings that often go unseen by the public. Local media revisited the story several times over the ensuing decades, particularly whenever murder-for-hire plots surfaced elsewhere, retelling the details of Robert Fratta's downfall as a warning against the allure of easy solutions to domestic disputes. Over time, new generations encountered the story through documentaries or retrospective news specials, discovering how thoroughly it had rocked a community that imagined itself relatively safe from such deliberate cruelty. In reflecting on the events, one sees how the homicide served as a pivot point for many. Some neighbors who had been close to Vicki or Robert found themselves reevaluating the subtle cues they had missed, signs of controlling behavior, expressions of resentment that were more serious than mere bluster. The ripple effect went beyond them. Local police agencies updated training guidelines to emphasize the potential lethality of domestic conflicts, urging officers not to underestimate the severity of threats made by spouses with a track record of hostility. Though justice was ultimately served, the city was left with a poignant lesson. No legal judgment can erase the pain of a life ended prematurely. Vicki's family continued to advocate for better systems to protect those trapped in dangerous relationships, offering to share her story as a cautionary example. Their efforts did spark more robust dialogues about protective orders and the hidden complexities of divorce proceedings, especially when an abuser is determined to manipulate every facet of the legal system. One can summarize the entire tragedy as the collision of a loving mother's aspirations and a controlling husband's obsession, culminating in an act of calculated violence that left a permanent scar. The final resolution, the convictions and subsequent sentences, reminded the public that even the most cunning murder schemes unravel under thorough investigation and determined prosecution. Just as importantly, it underscored how essential it is for communities, friends, and family to stay vigilant when they see ominous warning signs in a relationship. Looking back at the timeline, from the months of escalating hostility to the final gunshots that shattered a suburban night, it is clear that key turning points defined the case. The custody battle provided a motive. The middleman's confession provided the breakthrough. The forensic and financial evidence built an unassailable wall of proof. The trial's verdict brought some semblance of resolution, even if it could never bring true peace to Vicki's grieving loved ones. In the end, a sense of moral equilibrium was restored. Someone who misused authority and exploited others to commit murder was held responsible, ensuring that, at least in this instance, justice prevailed. Nevertheless, the story provokes unsettling questions about how many red flags were missed, how the system might have intervened sooner, and whether society does enough to protect individuals who sense they are in mortal danger. These are questions that persist long after the sentencing, challenging communities to examine the interplay between legal recourses, social support, and the hidden labyrinth of domestic terror. The resonance of Vicki's story is that even in a city as vast and resourceful as Houston, a motivated killer can slip through cracks until it is too late. It is a cautionary tale that demands both reflection and action. One of the legal precedents highlighted by the case is the clarity with which the Texas courts reaffirmed that those who orchestrate a murder by paying or persuading someone else to pull the trigger are just as culpable as the ones who carry out the physical act. This sent a strong message to individuals contemplating such schemes. The law would find them, and the courts would not spare them. The social impact is equally profound. Beyond the legal realm, the community grapples with the psychological toll of domestic violence, the persistent question of how to better identify individuals on the brink of lethal action, and the moral imperative to take each threat seriously. Policy-wise, the case reignited discussions on stricter protective orders and better training for social workers, though the path to implement comprehensive changes would be slow and complicated. As time continues its steady march forward, the memory of Vicki resonates as a call to confront domestic abuse in all its manifestations: verbal, emotional, financial, and physical. For every story that ends tragically, there is hope that heightened awareness might prevent a similar fate for someone else. The children whose mother was stolen from them in an act of premeditated horror grew into adults who carried the burden of that trauma. Their experiences illuminated the long-term consequences of domestic violence, showing how deeply such an event can shape lives. Support networks and therapy help them process their grief and confusion, transforming them into advocates for others who find themselves in terrifying domestic quarrels. Their voices, though shaped by sorrow, echoed a powerful message: no one should be forced to live in fear, and help must arrive before violence erupts. Ultimately, this story ends not just with a verdict, but with the reminder that vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to intervene can be the difference between life and death. For all the heartbreak that marked Vicki's final months, she left behind a legacy of love. Love for her children, love for her community, and love for the simple joys of everyday life that she cherished. Her memory, and the shattering events of November 9, 1994, stand as stark evidence of what can go wrong when an individual's thirst for control meets a society that struggles to respond in time. Reflecting on the chronology and the key evidence, it becomes clear that the thoroughness of the investigation, spanning forensics, financial analysis, and multiple witness interviews, was the linchpin that secured justice. Without each of those pieces, Robert might have walked free, emboldening others to see murder for hire as a viable path. Instead, the case became an emblem of law enforcement perseverance and legal thoroughness. Detectives, prosecutors, and everyday citizens working in tandem ensured that the voices calling for accountability were not drowned out by fear or legal maneuvering. In that sense, the resolution stands as a testament to the resilience of a community confronted with unimaginable loss. Every aspect of this tragedy serves as a stark reminder that behind each statistic about domestic violence lies a real person with aspirations, attachments, and an intrinsic right to live free of harm. Vicki's stolen future is a sobering call to action, to honor her by examining our own communities for hidden threats, to speak out when we see signs of escalating abuse, and to lend support to those who feel trapped by fear. Justice in this story was served in the legal sense, but true justice would have spared her life in the first place. In summing up the case, one observes how swiftly mounting tensions and hidden resentments culminated in violence. The timeline is etched in heartbreak, from Vicki's aspirations of a stable life, to the toxic marriage that eroded her sense of security, to the calculated execution that took her life. Critical evidence emerged in the form of phone records, ballistic tests, financial transactions, and confessions. These elements intersected at key turning points: the custody battle escalations, the middleman's admission, and forensic analysis linking the shooter to the scene. Ultimately, the resolution arrived through the judicial system's unwavering pursuit of truth, culminating in the conviction of Robert Fratta and his accomplices. The final outcome, a set of lengthy prison sentences, and the moral clarity of a guilty verdict, underscored the seriousness of orchestrated homicide in Texas and reaffirmed that no one is above accountability. Yet, the broader implications linger. Legally, the case reinforced the state's framework for prosecuting murder for hire, setting a prominent example that would inform future trials. Socially, it cast a harsh spotlight on domestic abuse, warning that controlling behavior can spiral into lethal violence if not promptly addressed. The community recognized anew the importance of supportive resources and protective orders, as well as the need to break the stigma that traps many victims in silence. For those left behind, the consequences were profound. A family fractured, children orphaned from their mother, and a circle of friends forever changed by the realization that tragedy can strike even in supposedly safe suburbs. The historical significance rests in how the case became a reference point for understanding domestic homicide as a multifaceted problem that law enforcement, legal systems, and social services must tackle in a collaborative manner. In reflecting on the tragedy, one sees a twofold lesson. First, the lines between personal vendetta and extreme criminality can blur alarmingly fast when fueled by obsession and the hunger for control. Second, an alert community and a robust legal system can still secure justice, even if they cannot reverse the heartbreak. Those lessons remain vital, urging every observer to remain vigilant and compassionate. The memory of what happened to Vicki stands as a testament to the urgency of intervening before tensions reach a breaking point. No conversation or phone call is too small to warrant attention if it signals a grave threat. From an everyday citizen's perspective, the simplest call to action is to remain attuned to warning signs of domestic discord and to speak up if danger seems imminent. Communities that engage in open dialogue about domestic abuse are better equipped to detect and diffuse crises. Though there is no simple formula for prevention, stories like Vicki's demonstrate the devastating consequences of silence. For anyone reading about this case, a pivotal takeaway might be the reminder that prevention begins with recognition. If you suspect someone is in a controlling or abusive situation, the single act of reaching out, whether by encouraging them to seek professional help, assisting them in contacting law enforcement, or just listening without judgment, can make a difference. It may feel daunting, especially when dealing with an individual as intimidating as Robert Fratta, yet multiple voices raised in support of a victim can give them the courage to take steps towards safety. In closing, it is worth posing a set of questions to readers and communities alike. How might you respond if a friend confided they feared for their life because of an ex-partner? What resources could you offer them? What knowledge do you have of local organizations that provide shelter or legal guidance? By discussing these questions openly, we create a culture where warnings do not go unheeded. Examining the finer details of Vicki's story may be painful, but it compels us to act more decisively when we see signs of danger in our own circles. That collective awareness is perhaps the most fitting tribute we can offer to a life cut short by violence. Have you ever encountered warning signs of domestic control or violence in someone you know? How did you respond, and what do you think could be done differently if the situation reoccurred? Sharing personal experiences, or even secondhand observations, can shed light on effective interventions. Conversely, for those who wonder whether the legal system does enough, examining the case's progression from initial investigation to final conviction invites debate on whether law enforcement agencies and courts have the tools they need to act swiftly. When we engage in community-based dialogue, discussing best practices and missed opportunities, we collectively refine our approach to preventing similar tragedies. Your voice, your questions, and your insights could prove invaluable. By speaking openly, we stand a better chance of recognizing the next Robert Fratta before he can carry out an unthinkable crime, or better still, persuading him never to attempt one at all.